So last time we did basics of LFG. We did C structure and F structure. Okay. And this time, and I motivated why we had grammatical functions or grammatical relations. And if you remember, I talked about the generalization for the passive. That you wanted to have something called a lexical rule. Do you remember what the motivation for that was, or what a lexical rule is? I think that went a bit fast at the end, maybe. So maybe if you look through your notes or look through your brain and find it. Okay, there was one example. And the other example, which I won't repeat because I think we went through that enough, was the Walbury free word order. Okay, we went through that. And that was meant to illustrate the separation, why you wanted to have a separation between C structure and F structure. Yeah? So that at C structure, languages could look quite different, but at F structure, you wanted the same dependency representation. I trust you remember that example. Yeah. How about the passive lexical rule one? Do you remember that example? The motivation that? I mean, there's many, many more motivations why you want to do it the way LFG does it, but these are at least two of them. Complete blank? No.
Generally, a passive construction is a sentence where an object becomes a subject.
Okay. So, yeah.
The subject becomes an adjunct or oblique. Hasn't to be realized necessarily.
Yeah, so adjunct, it would be optional then. And oblique, or it could be an oblique. And I'll talk about this more today, what that is, oblique. Oblique agent, it's called. Okay, so this is a lexical rule, right? This is what we ended up with. This is what LFG decided in the early 1980s, that one should treat passives like this. And there was a question last time, what about argument structure, agent, patient? There's a separate development that we'll talk about later with linking theory, where that's made better in a sense. But this is the basic lexical rule that people were talking about in the early 80s. And which still makes sense, because if you look at passives, generally objects become subjects in a passive, and the old subject is demoted. So you have, what was it? The tiger chased the cat was chased by the tiger, yeah? And LFG states this in terms of grammatical functions. Okay, that was the key insight. Rather than any kind of other thing. Rather than trying to do it via trees or transformations or talk about case marking or any of the other possibilities. Okay, so that was one of the motivations. So grammatical functions is an extremely important concept. Grammatical functions is the name for grammatical relations in LFG. Just to make sure that you don't get confused. Okay, so those were two things. So you really want to have this level of grammatical functions at F structure be a separate conceptual notion. Okay, and with that, the idea is you can explain a lot of things. Yeah? Okay, so now let's talk more about them. And I'll take you a step back. So more about them, meaning grammatical functions in LFG and what kind they are. And for that, I'll take a step back. I tend to like history. Not everybody does. but I tend to like it. Now, most of you will have had some exposure to something like subject in your grammar books, or if you had to learn a foreign language or something like that. So what's the subject? Okay, so the person who performs an action or what is being talked about, that is a definition. I'll read you the Oxford English Dictionary definition. The member or part of a sentence denoting that concerning which something is predicated. Very sort of careful thing, because it's not just always an action, right? It could also be John is smart or something like that, right? So, but you have this notion subject around for a long time, and that's the person or the thing about which this is about. Object, another concept. These concepts go back to the Greeks. They go back 2,000 years, yeah? So they're old concepts in principle. So what's an object? The thing that is being predicated of. The Oxford English Dictionary says a substantive word, phrase, or clause. It can also be a clause in that definition. Immediately dependent on or governed by a verb. And in a case of verb of action, the person or thing to which the action is directed. So basically the thing that is the object. Yeah. Then you also have indirect object. It's another traditional term. Okay, and what's the indirect object? It's something that's supposed to be indirectly affected by an action, but is not the immediate object. So, give me something, for example, the me in there. Give the dog. Oh, that's not a good example. Okay, we'll leave it at that. In German, it would be the dative one. So in German, it would be, if you have something like Hans gibt Maria einen Keks, it would be Hans gibt der Maria, so that would be dative. So it's sort of, this one is, in many languages, is marked with a dative. This one in many languages is marked with an accusative. And this one in many languages is marked with a nominative, at least in the languages we tend to be familiar with. But that's not a hard and fast rule, right? You could use it as an orientation. Okay, so LFG takes these sort of notions that are around all over the place, but it actually does something. It expands these and calls them slightly differently. So I'll just tell you what we have. So let's see, grammatical functions in LFG. So what we have is we have subject, object, and those are basically like these two. Then we have something called object theta, and that covers the concept of an indirect object plus other things. So this is a primary object, and this is secondary objects, all kinds of them. And if you look at languages across the world, you have different types of secondary objects. And I'll explain the theta in a moment. And then we have oblique theta. And these in English, obliques tend to be prepositional phrases, PPs, often. And we'll go into prepositional phrases in a separate lesson, in a separate session, because those get a bit complex as well. Okay. What is the theta? This stands for theta. And theta in general linguistics is short for thematic role. we'll get back to that, or we'll do that as part when we do linking theory. What this is supposed to express is that there is some kind of extra thematic role there. So what you would do is if you had the German, we'll do German now, Hans gibt dem Hund einen Knochen. And for those of you who don't speak German, Hans is a name. That's just Hans. This is gives. This is the dative. This is dog. This is a accusative. And this is bone. Accusative. Okay, so what we have is we have three things here. Three noun phrases. And the LFG analysis would say, what? What's Hans? Subject. What's ein Knochen? Let's do that one first. Yeah. The primary object, so an obj. And dem Hund would be no. An object theta, and in this case, yeah. So the theta stands for there's some thematic role, and then you're free to actually substitute in that thematic role. So what you generally do is say something like beneficiary maybe, or goal, or whatever, okay? And the reason you don't just write object theta is that in some languages you can get several of these, or you can give different ones. So you might want to notate exactly what kind of object it was, okay? So this is an object theta, and the specific instance of it in this case would be a beneficiary or a goal or something like that. Questions? There's some skeptical looks. Okay, so we have these. And then we have a few more. We also have something called an ex-comp and a comp. And these are all called the governable grammatical relations or grammatical functions. And I'll explain that in a minute. So what is comp and ex-comp? Comp is, let's start with comp. This is generally a clausal argument. And generally it's finite. So a typical example of this would be a that clause in English. I thought that he was taking the exam. Okay? So there's been some arguments in the literature whether you really need comp, because comp actually functions like an object. Yeah? I think a deep thought. I is the subject. A deep thought is the object. I think he's taking the exam with me. I think that he's taking the exam with me. That whole thing is the comp. Basically, it's being like an object, except that it's a finite clause. Okay, in LFG, the early versions of LFG decided to make this a separate grammatical function. Newer work within LFG is trying to get rid of comp. So you'll find papers saying get rid of comp. I think it's a fairly useful concept and it's part of classic LFG, so that's why we are introducing it here. Yeah. In contrast, what is this? This is also a clausal argument. It's typically non-finite though. And what does the X do? The X stands for, it's to indicate that it's an open function. So let's think about what that means. So this one, and we'll do a separate section, we'll do a separate session on comps and XComs as well, but I'll just give you an example. If you have something like, I want to eat cake. Okay, this is our subject. This thing is the XComp. The XComp itself has an object in it. Okay, and what's the subject? So there's two arguments of eat, right? Somebody's doing the eating and something is being eaten. So the something that's being eaten is the cake, and who's doing the eating? The I is doing the eating, so me. But that's over here. And the idea is that this is actually controlling. That's why these are called control verbs. An empty subject over here. Okay. And so the idea is that in the XComps, there is something there that needs to be controlled from the matrix subject, which is why this is considered to be an open function. And the comp is closed in retrospect, so there's nothing coming in from the outside. So that clause contains a whole finite sentence again. Yeah. Again, we'll go through this in more detail in a separate session. But does that make sense so far? This orientation? Okay. So I've already introduced the term argument here, and I've said governable grammatical relations. These things, all of these grammatical functions are arguments. What does that mean? Thinking back to your early linguistic training. Yeah. They are required by the predicate, yes. So in LFG terms, you would say arguments are write that again. Arguments are subcategorized for by the predicate. By the pred. I can't write R's for some reason. Okay. And one usually opposes arguments to adjuncts. Right? And the distinction is not always easy to make, but there are certain extremes. One can say this is an argument, this is an adjunct. So adjuncts are not subcategorized for by a predicate, right? They can just be added on. Subcategorized. Okay, and what else is important? Remember your one of each type. One subject, one object, one oblique of some type. And here you can have potentially infinitely many of each type. Potentially. So I'm not going to go through this in detail because you should know this. This is just so that you remember arguments, adjuncts, okay? And all of these are arguments. All these are subcategorized for by some verb. Okay, so these can only appear in an F structure if the verb or if some other predicate has said, I need a subject, I need an object, I need an ex-comp. And that's why they're called governable grammatical relations. Okay, so they're governed by some predicate. Okay, let's see, do I have them all? Okay, then there's a few things that one needs to go through. So we have arguments versus adjuncts. For the adjuncts, we also have grammatical functions. Let's put it in blue. We have two. We have adjunct. And we have ex-adjunct. Okay, and again, the X here means that this is an open type of thing. And the typical example of that is something like having eaten, I went to bed. So I went to bed is the main sentence. Okay, and this is a clausal, not argument this time, but adjunct. And again, just like with the ex-comp, there's a subject there, right? So who did the eating? Generally me, the I. Okay, so again, we have adjuncts, and these things can be all kinds of stuff. So PPs, adjectives, adverbs, etc. And those will be closed, and then we have an open one again, where you assume that the subject is coming from somewhere else. Okay, and they're not governed because they're adjuncts. Okay, so far, makes sense? Yeah? Okay, now there's a few more things that people have said about how these grammatical functions, the subcategorized for ones, are organized. There is something that there's a distinction one makes. So first one, put this away. You have a distinction between, what is the official terminology? Semantically restricted. Restricted and unrestricted. Semantically unrestricted. Okay, all of the things that I'm talking about here can be found spelled out in some detail in Mary Dalrymple's chapter 2 in Lexical-Functional Grammar. Okay, so you can look that up there too. There's a distinction made just with respect to these in terms of semantically restricted and non-restricted, whereby semantically refers to thematic roles. Okay, so it's not actually real semantics, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's about thematic roles. So these grammatical functions are generally divided into things that are specific to a particular thematic role versus not. So having said that, you should actually be able to categorize them. So which ones are semantically restricted and which ones aren't?
Subject and object
Are? So subject and object are not semantically restricted. Okay, and if you look at examples, Mary Dalrymple has a lot of examples. Subjects can be all kinds of things. They could be agents, they could be experiencers. I felt bad. I is the subject. I kicked somebody. I is an agent. So you can have all kinds of stuff. The same goes for objects. So you can run through examples in languages. Okay, which else? Which other ones? So we've done 2. Oh, sorry, I put it on the wrong column. Okay.
Object theta and oblique theta are semantically restricted.
That's right. So object theta and oblique theta are semantically restricted. And the idea there is that these secondary objects and these obliques, they tend to have some extra semantics with them, something like benefactive or directional or locative and stuff like that. So they tend to be governed by some kind of semantic preposition or by something that makes it very specific to a certain thematic role. Okay, and ex-comp and comp are basically like objects, so they go over here. Yeah, so that's sort of the idea behind that. Okay, so done that. So now you are a linguist. Imagine you're in Australia. In Australia, what they do with their master students, they say, okay, your duty is to go out and describe a language before it dies out. Off you go. So you go off, you know your phonology, of course, you know all kinds of stuff, and you have to record this language and you have to figure out what the subject is, what the objects are, etc. What do you do? So I've given you the nice theory, and actually LFG gets used a lot in language description. Australia is a very LFG-friendly continent. So how do you know something is a subject or an object?
About subject agreement.
Okay, so there's suggestion with case and agreement is a suggestion, yeah.
What kind of thematic role it's playing?
What kind of thematic role it's playing, yeah. But we just saw subjects and objects are unrestricted, so. But yeah, that makes a difference. At least with actually, so it's not quite true. Agents tend to be subjects, generally. Not always, but generally. Okay, so those are some good suggestions. So, tests for GF, and GF stands for grammatical function, status. There was some effort in the 70s, etc., to find sort of some universal principles. It turns out that universal principles don't work. Each language has its own set of properties that come together to say that this is a subject, this is an object. But there are some tests that you can try that tend to work across languages. There is a very good paper by Ed Keenan on subjecthood tests. And he looked at difficult languages like Malagasy and things like that. So what you need to do when you work on a new language, you need to figure out what the tests would be for this language. And some of the tests that do work, but again, you have to be careful, are the one that we had before, case, is a good indicator. In some languages, it is the indicator. So in German, if it's nominative, it's a subject, generally. German seems to be quite strict about this. I'm looking at Christine, you can correct me. If so, okay. So in some languages, like in German, it's actually nominative as subjects, datives tend to be object thetas, accusatives tend to be objects, although we can have several accusative objects in a sentence. Ich lehrte ihn das Fürchten. Yeah, so why don't I put that one on? Where you do have a little bit of a problem. Ich lehrte ihn das Fürchten. So this is I taught he, accusative, the, what is this, fearing. I taught him to fear. And this is also accusative. So there you have to worry about it. You have to say subject. This is subject. It's nominative. I forgot to put that in. And then you have two accusatives. Okay, now one of these is going to be the direct object, and one of these is going to be the indirect object. Which one is which?
Das Fürchten is the direct object.
Okay, and why are you saying that other than you have instinct as a German? That's where it gets tricky. And this would be an object theta then, yeah? And one could worry about what kind of theta exactly. So, yeah.
Did you say that in German the accusative object definitely is the subject in a passive sentence?
Yep, very good test. One test you can try for object status is passivization. Yeah, so if an object ends up being a subject after you've passivized the sentence, then that's a good indication that it is a subject. So does that work here? So Germans help me. So you can say, das Fürchten lehrte ich ihn. Nee, das Fürchten wurde ihm gelehrt durch mich. So that would be the subject. Can you do it the other way around? Wurde das Fürchten gelernt durch mich? No. Okay, so that seems to be a good indication that this is the object. Yeah. So for German that works. Generally passivization is a good test. Again, not for all languages. It won't work for all languages. How do we know this is the subject? I just put that there. But in fact, in German you have agreement with the subject. In German you always have subject agreement. Well, not always, but if you're agreeing with the subject. And you don't agree with objects, and you don't agree with indirect objects and other things. Okay, so in German, whatever the verb is agreeing with tends to be the subject. So that's another one. Agreement. Again, it doesn't work for all languages. Not all languages have agreement. Some languages do complicated agreement. Georgian has subject agreement, object agreement, indirect object agreement. It's trying very hard. But it's also had syncretism in its morphology, so you often can't tell. Okay, what else? So there's a certain set of tests that you can go through, and Mary Dalrymple talks about some of these tests in her chapter 2. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. You have to figure them out for each language. I'll take questions though. If you have any questions. So we'll go through the course and we'll do some analyses and try to see whether we can come up with good tests for these things. For English, they're fairly well established. For other languages, if you go out into the field, it's a difficult question. Okay. Okay, but the point is we're not just calling things at random object theta, but we're trying to make sure that we establish tests for all of these things. And then I'd be done with grammatical functions for now. Yeah? Okay, so then the next part, we're still doing LFG basics, so now we've done grammatical functions. The next part is about how to draw your C structures. So in principle, you can draw any kind of C structures you want. You can draw wild and crazy C structures. You could draw C structures like this. Say, I'll call the top thing an NP, and it has a verb in it, and that'll go to an S, and that does something else. Okay, you could draw, in principle, just from the technological part of the theory, you could draw everything. But you want to have a theory of C structure. And what LFG does, it's taken over, or it incorporates what syntacticians in general have figured out about phrase structure in languages. In particular, it assumes the general categories that you have, and it assumes some version of X bar theory. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, and which parts of speech there are, or what kinds of heads there are. Heads, major categories. So some of this should be familiar to you, but we should talk about it again just to make clear. So what kinds of categories do we have? Should be easy, right? We have things like noun, yeah, adjective, verb, preposition. What else do we have? Determiner. Okay. Yes, we have one. The question is, does it also have to project? Okay, we're done with this set of notes. What else is missing? So generally, these are considered to be the core lexical categories. Lexical categories. And I think most syntacticians will agree that one has these. Okay, this is adjective. That we have nouns, adjectives, or preposition. Although people fight about, for some languages, whether these languages have adjectives at all, or whether they have verbs at all. So again, you have to think about what is an adjective, what is a noun, what are my criteria for saying something is an adjective. Okay. And then we have some functional categories that we generally assume. And these are C and I. You should have seen those before as well. C stands for complementizer. And I stands for inflection. Okay, now how would we draw a tree? Let's see, which way should I do this? So let's take a very simple sentence in English first. And let's draw a tree. Let's see what your intuitions are. So let's take the tiger has chased the cat. Okay, so what tree would you draw? And some of you have taken syntax before. No ideas? Last time I drew a tree. You don't have to do what I did. But what tree would you want to draw? And why? And how? Hang on, yeah, there.
You can start bottom up and just assign lexical categories first, and then start from there.
Okay, we can start from that. We can start with the parts of speech. Say this is a noun, this is a verb, this is a noun, this is a determiner, and this is an auxiliary, right? Or usually one says that this is the part that carries the actual tense inflection, so that is usually called an I in syntax. Okay. And now over many decades of research, people formulated something that's called this X-bar theory, and the idea there is, you probably remember, is that if you have a head, this head projects in a certain way, so that you have, it was either written like this or like this. Hang on, other way around. Okay, so you would have a maximal phrase, an intermediate phrase, and the terminal, and this would be the head of the phrase. Okay. X-bar theory was developed in the 70s, the first versions, and Joan Bresnan, one of the inventors of LFG, was one of the first ones to co-invent it. Just a historical note, it's called X-bar. It's written like this. Why? Because back in those days they couldn't type this. So they put a thing next to it. Okay. So that's that. So the idea is that generally in syntax what you have is this kind of structure. Okay, and most people will agree to this kind of binary structure. Now other theories, the Chomsky-oriented theories, are very, very strict about this kind of binary branching structure. LFG is not as strict about it. It does believe in general projection like this, but it's also happy to just leave out nodes. So if you don't have a node, it's happy to leave that out, which is a bit odd, but I'll show you an example of that. Okay. One thing it's very clear, LFG is clear that you have to have these two functional categories. These are functional categories. I forgot to write that down. Functional categories. Okay, it's not so sure about others. So somebody mentioned determiner. There's a debate still going on whether this actually needs to be like this. So if you assume that determiner is one of these projecting categories, then you would have to have this kind of tree. You would say, I'm a D going to a DP, and this is my complement. Okay? So I should also say this. This position is generally the complement position, and this is the specifier position. And it's very easy to see how that works when you have a verb. Let's take it out of this tree. So if you have a verb, like chase, then you would have an NP here, which would be the cat. And then something, well, no. And then further up, there would be a specifier, which should be actually, this is actually not so easy to see, the tiger. So that's the principle, that you should actually have a specifier here, the subject and the cat over here, but then that's not what you want your tree to look like. So you have a bit of a problem, and people solve that problem in a different way. I'm not going to tell you. And I'll tell you, there was a VP internal subject hypothesis, and then you had to move out. Okay, let's get rid of this. Let's try it the other way. No. I won't go into it. So there's a question of whether this should be the head of the phrase or that should be the head of the phrase. Okay? Now, there's arguments for either one. Generally in LFG we've said, well, DP should not be one of these projecting categories. It's more like this, that you have an N bar, and this is this. This takes that, and then you have an NP on top of that. Okay? So in general you would have this as an NP phrase. Now, how about the rest? So let's do the same for here. Let's call this an NP. One thing you have to respect is constituency, right? This is a constituent. This is a constituent. How do you know things are a constituent? Again, this is now Mary Dalrymple's chapter 3, who explains it a bit better than I do. A lot better than I do. But so one of the things you have to figure out is constituency for your C structure. Conjunctions, so you can, if you can coordinate two things of the same time, you coordinate two constituents, the tiger and the cat. Yeah. You can move it around. In English is a bit harder to move around things, but yeah, that's right. So you could have the cat chase the tiger. You can do pronominal substitution. The tiger chased it. All those old tests you should remember. So that's one of the things you should respect. Okay, now generally, let me finish this. So this will project to an I bar, and it will take a VP as a complement. And then this. So this is the kind of tree that would be a standard LFG analysis for this kind of sentence in English. So what you have is you have the inflectional item is taken to be the head, and this goes back to research on English and French, and which has established this, at least for English. That head projects to this, to an intermediate phrase. At the intermediate phrase level, this is considered to be the complement in a sense. And this is its specifier, the subject. The I bar takes a VP, which consists of a V and an NP. And again, you can show that this is a constituent. You can also show that this is a constituent. So you would have that kind of tree. Yeah.
Is the determiner considered as a specifier then? Or?
Yeah, so it would be a type of specifier, yeah. Well, it should be then 1 over, right? Yeah. Mary very cleverly leaves out determiners. So what you're saying, if it's a specifier, it should actually be up there, right? And something like that, yeah. That tree's better. Thank you. So my excuse is I work on Urdu and you don't have this problem. Okay, so anyway, so you assume some kind of this projection. So you assume as a default that if you have a lexical category or a functional category that projects, then it will project. But if there's something that's not there, then you don't have to have anything that's empty. So to contrast this, what happens? Now I must say, I personally find this a bit weird, but this is what the state of the art right now is. So what if you have the tiger chased the cat? What kind of tree will this get? Well, we have our usual thing, determiner, noun, verb, determiner, noun. Okay, we can abbreviate these into an NP. This will be VP. Now what? So the way it plays out is where's the tense information in this case? The tense information in this case is actually in here, right? Now other theories, what they do is they take this apart and say, oh, we have chase, and then we have, this is our I. Okay? Now LFG has something which is called the principle of lexical integrity, and this is considered to be very important. And what that means is that you don't take apart words in the syntax. So words, morphologically formed words, go into the syntax as a unit. You don't distribute them around your tree. Okay, this is very different from what other theories do. And that has certain consequences. And in part we can do that because the fact that this will have tense information will be at F structure. We don't need to show it at C structure. Okay, the fact that this will be past tense will be reflected at the F structure. We'll have subject, object, tense past, indicative, all those things, right? That will be at F structure. We don't need it in the tree. What we need in the tree is constituency, linear order, hierarchy, and some kind of reasonable way of things to be projected so that you don't want to do complete craziness. And so what LFG ended up with in this case is to have something like this. And so what you say is, okay, there's an IP. It doesn't have a head, but we know there has to be an IP because we know the sentence is tense. So basically in LFG, IP means tensed clause. Okay, and if you're assuming that this is a tensed clause, then you put that as the very top. And then, well, an actual I is missing, but hey. Okay, I personally find this a bit weird, but you know, this is. So the idea is that with this X bar schema that we had up there, in principle, these pieces could be missing, right? So any of these pieces could be missing. This one, this one, this one. They don't have to be actually overtly realized. And in this case, the I is sort of stuck in here, but you don't have to pull it out and put it in the tree. Okay, so questions about this? I'd have lots of questions, but you know, okay. This is how it is for the moment. There's one more small thing that I want to tell you about. Well, I'll show it to you now. And then we can probably do it again next time, which is that there is a distinction that's made between okay, I'm gonna make all this go away. Exocentric structures versus endocentric structures. Okay. And I have a hard time remembering this, but if you know your bugs, apparently your insects, the endo type of insects are which ones? Something in biology. Okay, so the idea is that, I'll make sure I get it the right way around. This is called an endocentric structure. That's because everything is coming from the inside. And then we have exocentric, our good friend Walbury again. That is considered to have an exocentric structure. And let me show you that, what that looks like. So this is the sentence we had from last time, NP. And this NP is Kurdu, what was it? And what did this mean? I'm sure you remember. Child dual ergative. Okay, that was our subject. And we have this kind of a structure. And remember from last time that the ox had to be here. Always had to be in second position. This is present tense. And then normally here in English we would have a VP. But in Walbury, what they assume is an NP and a verb and another NP, I guess. And this one was Maliki, dog. This one was G. Pili, ni, chase, non-past. Okay, and this NP over here was, I have to have it go over here, beta, and this meant small, dual ergative. Okay, so the point here is, why is one doing something like this? Why is one not calling this a VP? One is not calling that a VP because, in fact, it's not just a VP. You can have all kinds of stuff in here. A VP is supposed to contain a verb plus an object, right? Where you have verb and object and other things in there as well. You could have more and more of these. And these all are freely reorderable. Well, not freely, but reorderable. So you have free word order. So you could have these in any order whatsoever. Okay, again, that's not what the concept of a VP is in syntax. You're supposed to have a verb and a complement. But here you can have many things. Not binary branching. There's 3 things here. You could have more things. Okay, and you can reorder them all. So the idea is that this is actually an exocentric category. It's not being projected by anything. There's not an S, S bar, SP. It's a phrase label, and it's not coming from any lexical item. No lexical item, no functional item. So you have those kinds of categories as well. Okay, and you tend to distinguish between languages. You say these languages have exocentric categories. Languages like Walbury, they tend to be languages that allow for free word order variation. And you have languages like English, which only have endocentric categories. And this just didn't come out of nowhere. There are several dissertations you can read about the reasoning behind this. Paul Kroger in 1993 wrote on Tagalog. Rachel Nordlinger in 1998 wrote on Wambaya in Australian language. Tagalog's spoken in the Philippines. Okay, so they looked at the patterns in those languages and figured out what the C structure should be and came up with this generalization. So there's many, many, many reasons why you would want to do it this way. Okay, so the point here is just you need to be aware of the fact that you generally in LFG you try to project from a lexical or functional category, but you do have exocentric categories where you don't have this requirement. Okay, and that wraps it up for today.